Welcome back to Posting Through It. I'm Jared.
And I'm Mike. Before we start, I want to remind everybody that we are a listener-supported show. That's the way we get down. We don't do ads on here. And we have an upgrade to our executive club team. This is Rebecca Krausikowski. And an upgrade to our platinum tier, Damon Levrink.
If you're going to be in D.C. or want to plan to, on April 11th, be sure to come to Politics and Prose, where Mike and I will be IRL, in the flesh, talking about Mike's book, which is coming out in just a few weeks, Strange People on the Hill. That's still available for pre-order from Hachette's website with the code STRANGE20 for 20% off that pre-order. If you make it out, we've got some small little gifts, some surprises that we're going to give out. And whatever's left over, going to find a way to raffle it off to our Patreon supporters. But
they're very cool. I just want to say what these are. This is this is all from the mind of Jared, although, it's me too, but seriously, they're very cool.
And our listener music this week is from a listener named Steven, who has a project called High Tides in Malibu, California. The track is called Swaying Palms. If you listen to the show and you make music, be sure to send it my way. We love playing listener tunes on the show, and this is a very chill West Coast kind of vibe. So we've talked about it a lot on recent episodes. The MAGA movement has an anti-Semitism problem in its ranks that only seems to be growing more dire. From our read of it, it's starting to freak some of the movement's leaders out. The Iran war is just the latest event to highlight these cracks, but because we mention it so much and it's come up on so many episodes, especially recently, we thought it would be worth the time to sit down and really unpack what's been happening in more detail. We've got a great guest, Art Levine, who sat down with us to talk about this, whether it's Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, the Nick Fuentes of the world, all the memes online about making Israel great again. I mean, that's all just recent memory stuff, right?
Yeah. When I worked at Newsweek, they assigned me supposed to be a cover story about growing anti-Semitism on the right that never got published. And at the time, I was writing a lot of stories about what was then the alt-right movement. And I would, at that time, I was kind of sewing together this anti-Semitic wing of the right and what they were trying to do to mainstream culture. And it's really fascinating to me just think about those people in that time and how it felt then. Because at that time, it was Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer. It was Mike Penovich of the Right Stuff Network, these type of guys. And they were all considered fringe, marginal people, extremists. And it's kind of scary to me to think that they actually succeeded, right? That the right really shifted in this profound anti-Semitic direction after their activism. And all those guys were kind of destroyed or chewed up in the process.
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of sacrificial lambs, but their goal, I mean, they talked about it quite openly at the time, was basically to push cultural, social discourse into a territory that was so far that eventually it would kind of ripple across the Republican Party and the MAGA movement and become the norm. Yeah, I mean, just listening to people like Stephen Miller talk, or seeing the ramblings of I don't know, pick an administration official or pick a Republican campaign for office these days. It's really not very far removed from those episodes of The Right Stuff that I would listen to back in the day, maybe minus the coin sound effects and the racial slurs.
And maybe anti-Semitism itself is the one thing that you could say hasn't really crossed over in the same way. The mass deportations now certainly is the same anti-immigrant rhetoric from the alt-right era. Anti-Black racism that's been a thing, right, for for as long as we had that, like, the black crime, vertical on Breitbart and all that stuff. That's been a regular feature of Republican politics. But it feels like this is like the last hurrah, where this turning the party fully anti-Semitic, getting them completely on board with those, like, sort of Zog conspiracies and everything like that. And, it's kinda disconcerting to think about not only those guys succeeding, but also that they're not even around. It's just sort of this new generation that is kind of speaking exactly like them.
Well, let's go ahead and get on with our interview with Art Levine. We had a lot of fun talking to him. Joining Posting Through It now, we have Art Levine. He's a longtime prize-winning reporter who's been the contributing editor at Washington Monthly and written for an array of publications you've probably heard of: The American Prospect, Salon, The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, Mother Jones, Truth Out, and many, many more. He's also the author of a book called Mental Health Incorporated, which takes an investigative look at the mental health industry in the United States. He recently wrote a great feature story for the Washington Spectator about MAGA's internal battle over anti-Semitism in its ranks, something we've talked about on this show quite a bit and wanted to unpack a bit more. Art, welcome to Posting Through It.
It's a real privilege. You two are really among the very top researchers on extremism in the country, and no false modesty is allowed. I think you guys are great. So
Thank you.
That's my view.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
You wrote this story for the Washington Spectator. It took a really deep look at anti-Semitism in the GOP and the kind of efforts that, party leaders, top organizers, nonprofits, that sort of thing, have taken or not taken in many cases to address it. And I'm curious for you. I mean, you've been covering politics for a long, long time. Was there a tipping point here where you felt like this issue had gotten so severe that it deserved a magazine-length feature story?
Yeah, well, the starting point, and this was inspired by my editor, Hamilton Fish, who knows the landscape very well of politics, and he suggested, and the initial input was the hypocrisy of the Trump administration's crackdown on campuses, talking about, claiming anti-Semitism. And early on in May, NPR was among the first of the publications who kind of referenced, well, look, there's some people affiliated with the administration itself that are kind of anti-Semitic, Semitic friendly, or have ties to neo-Nazis or those kind of people. And so there was that initial coverage, and that was kind of the original intent. And then as I got into it, we had to raise this whole other welter of issues, how deep the anti-Semitism flowed throughout MAGA and the Republican Party, looking at also the role of the implicit and explicit anti-Semitism that went along with Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism that was such a powerful force for bringing Trump into power. So I was looking into that, and then the kind of dam broke with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And that assassination in September, 9th or whatever, a terrible day in September, that kind of opened up the floodgates because all these influencers were seeking to reshape the narrative and come forward with essentially anti-Semitic narratives. And and we'll talk about it, of course, Candace Owens, and then Tucker Carlson's that that helped focus the mind, like the Tucker Carlson interview with Nick Fuentes, who literally, I think it was just 2 years ago, was booted out of CPAC, or maybe it was 3 years ago. He
Yeah.
was too toxic.
Well, he was booted out of CPAC for years before that, and had to found a completely separate PAC event, which is the APAC, his sort of APAC event, which is the way Fuentes did it.
In other words, through 2025 and 2024, he was not attending CPAC events. He was still persona non grata in theory. And then this is what it's something about all of them jockeying for power, likes, audiences that brought out the floodgates. And my view is part of it, especially with Candace Owens, is there's gold in them there anti-Semitism hills. In other words, this is a gold rush that has been great, because this is so fabulous for the right-wing influencers to be able to tap into the oldest hate. It's called the longest hate for a good reason. And this is what was so significant to me as I got deeper into it, which is the fig leaf of keeping a distance from extremists, which had been part of, in other words, dog whistles and so on, which had been part of the Republican branding since the Goldwater era. And the mythology, the noble William F. Buckley got the anti-Semites out of the Republican Party, and now we're not tolerating them anymore. And by the way, look how good we are about Israel. So that had been this central mythology, but that sort of disappeared pretty quickly. And the best book, and also his writings, is David Korn's book, American Psychosis, where he does a deep dive into what he calls playing footsies with neo-Nazis, which essentially has been what's been going on. So, and I did, so I got into it, and then things just kept unfolding. So, in other words, the original impetus was hypocrisy of the Trump administration. Then things just get crazier and crazier, and then then in October, I hope this isn't too convoluted to recap. Then in October, Tucker gives his platforming and softball interview to Fuentes, and suddenly the Heritage Task Force on Anti-Semitism, which had been focused completely on the left-wing pro-Palestinian movement, discovered, to their shock, and I compare it to Captain Renaud in Casablanca, that there's gambling at Rick's Cafe. He's shocked. They're shocked to discover that there's anti-Semitism on the right. And just a year earlier, one of the members of that task force, but not one of the breakaway members, said literally to the Jewish Insider, said he denies that there's any role of anti-Semitism in the conservative movement. Flat out. Like, that was their mindset. And then suddenly, when Kevin Roberts, the president of Heritage, basically defended Tucker, and then, either clueless, or he's so in the bubble of anti-Semitism, denounces critics of Tucker as part of the globalist class. So by this point in time, both the people getting the dog whistles of anti-Semitism and the monitors of anti-Semitism like yourselves understand what globalist means.
Well, it was really a way for Alex Jones to avoid saying Jews.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's the way I always thought of it.
I mean, I think you're right to pinpoint the dam breaking with Charlie Kirk's assassination. We've covered it quite a bit on this show, but after Charlie Kirk died, this question came up of who is going to take the mantle of what Charlie Kirk was building, his supposed influence on young people, which I think did legitimately grow towards the end, what would be a premature end to his life. but was maybe a little suspect early
Right.
on. Um, and Nick Fuentes, to our disgust, a lot of people surprised started coming up as like, well, is this somebody who could fill these shoes? And there seemed to be a non-zero amount of people who were willing to entertain that question.
Right.
And I think it was just off to the races at that point. You saw, you wrote a bit about the America Fest conference
Right.
Turning Point USA had last
That's
year,
in the
where
December, yes.
you had dueling speeches of like Ben Shapiro saying, we got to get Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, and Tucker Carlson. These people are disgusting. And then virtually every other speaker saying, listen, this is a big tent. You need to chill out.
Right.
Like,
Particularly J.D. Vance. So it's really important. J.D. Vance says our president didn't build his movement with purity tests, which is basically essentially, hey, neo-Nazis, anti-Semites, welcome aboard. And then during the middle of this America Fest, Erica Kirk endorses J.D. Vance. And one point I pointed out is the only people who criticized the extreme, explicit anti-Semites on the stage of the America Fest was Ramaswamy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name, and Ben Shapiro. He's Hindu. He's Jewish. Not a single Christian on the stage criticized explicit anti-Semitism. I know that Cruz and Lindsey Graham, of all people, have been critical of that. But on the stage, which is the largest conservative gathering, there's nothing comparable in size or impact to the size of that AmFest, and that there wasn't a single. Now, I profile a sincere young 28-year-old, very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel guy, Dimas Guaico, who's a son of a minister and has brought people to argue against the anti-Semitism that was in the ranks of Charlie Kirk, and I profile him. And here's how crazy the anti-Semitism is. I thought this should be of interest to you, is this. I'm Jewish, and Jews, like every other ethnic group, are very aware of all the slurs and mythologies that I learned from him that one of the pro Charlie Kirk people was basically cutting up coins and handing it to him at their booth, going, "This is what you're for." And he's referring to a medieval smear that led to mass executions in the 1200s in England of
some deep cut Jew hate there.
Right, that's right. It's a deep cut where he's about Jews were shaving off the silver filings to collect, and they went on trial, and there were some mass executions, and like I had not even heard of that, and so so this is well beyond the Great Replacement theory, the, and these were the Nick Fuentes supporters there.
Well, I just wanted to interject one thing before we continue on this track. You had mentioned, if I'm wrong, but just sort of some of the underlying conditions that preceded this. I mean, there was always, obviously, the alt-right movement was really, a very influential thing, basically 2014 to 2018. I kind
Right.
of ended there for them in the sense that they continue to exist, but their influence kind of went on and so forth. One thing you mentioned was like the anti-Semitism of Christian Zionists, which may not be inherently clear to every listener necessarily, but is a big factor. So as I understand it, these are people who perhaps are very like pro-Israel, and they're ostensibly Zionists, but they have this kind of like death cult mentality about it, where they also assume that the Jews are going to die in some sort of like apocalyptic thing or whatever, and that's why they want everybody in Israel. I don't know what. Tell me a little bit about that, because Charlie Kirk was ostensibly a Christian Zionist.
There's different variations of it. The official name is premillennia dispensationalism. And the notion in some quarters of Christian Zionists is that to to make Jesus' return possible, and this became important just the last week in terms of the commanders talking to their troops. But let me explain, which is the book of Revelation supposedly says that 144,000 Jews will convert, in Israel, and then the rest may perish in the battle of Armageddon. And so it is sort of a death wish. And I sort of joke that, and I quote this fabulously insightful filmmaker, David Haspel, who says about this two quotes that are really on point. One, first of all, Political Research Associates, which I linked to in my article, has a deep dive on this called End Time Anti-Semitism. But it's not made explicit. Now, even though it's not made explicit, Haspel points out that for Israeli officials who don't believe a word of this, they're comfortable for all the strong Christian Zionist support. And he says that Israeli government officials view the Christian Zionists as useful idiots, and the Christian Zionists view the Israeli as useful idiots for their mutual agendas, and there's this sort of philo-Semitism, and there's a brilliant video that I believe I linked to, but is worth seeing. Matthew Tyler, who wrote The Violent Take It by Force, a deep dive into New Apostolic Reformation, points out that anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, which is what the Christian Zionists espouse, are sort of two sides of the same coin, which is that they are set apart from humanity. And the Christian Zionists have this sort of instrumentalized view of the role of Jews. So they can be, in the near term, very pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, but their theology is looking forward to these horrible outcomes.
It's like saying, this is my favorite calf or whatever, but you're like feeding it for slaughter.
And his line is, the Christian Zionists, he says, some people might say that the Christian Zionists are like cattle ranchers who love their cattle. In other words, these are people being fed and cared for prior to the slaughter that is going to affect most of them, but not all of them. And then I quote another journalist who said, if you take it all together, if you take the Christian Zionism and the Christian nationalism, which is, all Jews and everybody else are third-rate citizens who don't count, and you bring in the neo-Nazis and everybody affiliated with the right, and even some on the left, what you have is a goal of a Jew-free world, but mostly on the right. Now, you'll never, but this is not something that's spoken about explicitly, you see, because obviously it'd be a turnoff if Ted Cruz says, well, there's terrible anti-Semites, Tucker Carlson, and oh yes, we're for as many missiles to go to Israel so they can continue to attack Iran and engage in war crimes in Gaza, because maybe this will bring about the conflagration. And the reality of that was brought together by the amazing scoops of Jonathan Larson, then picked up by NPR in the last week, where these commanders were trying to, give an upbeat read on the Iran war, because let's go forward, because this will be bringing about the end times and Jesus' return. So it's all good.
If this sounds donkey do balls insane to people, I will just say that when I was reporting out that Mother Jones story, about extremism in North Idaho, I went to a church there in which there was it was like the main stage was just like a movie theater kind of stage. It was a converted movie theater. And on one side, there's a huge American flag. And the other side, there was a huge Israeli flag. I mean, huge. Right. In the middle of Idaho, these people were never going to go there. And I was there. When I came in, I was like, this is crazy. First of all, why is this foreign country giving equal thing to an American flag? I mean, I found that very bizarre. Like, no matter what, I mean, it could be the Jamaican flag, it could be anything. It's very strange to have that relationship. But then also the other thing is just that it also has this underlying apocalyptic vision. Jared, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I mean, it it's totally bizarre. It's totally crazy. Like you, Mike, in my reporting days, I've run into this head on. I've been like reporting at religious right conferences, attending the dinners and stuff, and hearing people. You often hear about it as like, well, we have to support Israel because it's God's will. And then,
Right.
I would like turn to somebody at the table and be like, what's that mean exactly? And they're like, oh, Revelation. Have you read the book of Revelation? And I'm like, okay, cool. That's what I thought it meant. But kind of going back to your story, right? You start reporting on the hypocrisy angle, and you start digging a hole, and it turns out there's a massive, oil well beneath it
Right.
that is
It's
firing.
also equivalent to this is harking back for baby boomers who know the Art Bell show. It's like Mel's hole, this massive hole of outrageous monstrosities underneath the surface that's been there in various ways, and then the right people are striking oil in this right now. Leaders in the Republican Party, they're striking in below, and now it's spurting up.
You were talking about how, even a year ago, 2 years ago, leaders in the Republican Party were pretty insistent, and maybe it was some form of denial or cope, or they were just lying through their teeth, that the right doesn't have a serious anti-Semitism problem. These are people on the fringes. We denounce them, get lost. But in the last few months, it seems that the GOP is really kind of starting to recognize this is a serious problem for them. What's your take on this? Because you included some of it in your piece. There was a little conference that talked about it explicitly just
Right.
this week at the Republican Jewish Coalition in partnership with the National Review. There was a conference, and Ted Cruz spoke about this as if it's a problem. It seems that sort of poison beneath the surface is now clearly on the surface,
Oh,
and
yeah, in so
and
many
and,
different
and people
ways.
and people in the party are starting to get a little freaked out.
I think they are. My view is sort of mixed on this. I think any voice, even if even if Ted Cruz is motivated by end times anti-Semitism, I think it's good that he's critical of overt anti-Semitism. However, that is not what's happening, and that's where I recite these the Manhattan Institute, and they keep popping up, these chats and phone messages and in signal messaging of extreme anti-Semitism keep popping up among a younger generation of Republicans.
Yeah, we've
So
had we've had what, like 3 or 4, flagship stories at major
right,
publications about young GOP activists
right,
saying
saying
Hitler rocks.
right, Hitler was rocks, I love Hitler, using the N-word and, all sorts of so and the Atlantic did a good article how anti-Semitic views are rising across it. So right now, the problem that everybody is facing, I think, both in the Republican and the mainstream Democrats and establishment Democrats, is there's no messaging that's both critical of overt anti-Semitism and critical of Israel's actions overseas in Gaza and in Iran that is helping drive anti-Semitism. And as I mentioned, off camera to Jared, one of the most respected researchers, Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote, wrote a book about denial, and took David Irving to court, and all this stuff is, was an ambassador about anti-Semitism. She was asked by Ezra Klein, well, what role does this is before Iran, does the Israeli attacks on Gaza have in this? Oh, she said, oh, that anti-Semitism was always there. They just latched onto that as an excuse. And it's my view that's kind of willful blindness. If you have the leading Jewish state in the world, the only Jewish state in the world, and you have an overt a pro-authoritarian leader, engaging in mass slaughters that are read by the world and particularly young people on their phones and TikTok and videos, it can't but help raise the level of anti-Semitism. So the problem that the Republicans have is they're so hawkish on Israel, they're not very good messengers about anti-Semitism. So one of my little
So
insights is
they don't really have a message even. It's mostly just to you better shut up or we'll shut you up is
Yeah,
kind of where
yeah.
they
I
are with
mean, it's the
anti-Semitism.
yeah. I mean, a big problem with anti-Semitism rising is that people are equating the actions of the Israeli government with Jews, just
right,
Jews, right?
right,
It's like, this is Jews. This is what Jews are, right? And rather than come up with some kind of messaging that's like you said, critical of the Israeli government or has space for that criticism of, what we've seen in Gaza take place over the last couple years, you instead have organizations like the ADL or like
right.
countless politicians or whatever trying to pass laws and universities saying no, 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 no. If you're mad about what's happening in Israel, you're mad at Jews and you don't even know it. And it's like,
Right, and so
you're
one of the
kidding me.
issues
What do you think the byproduct of that is going to be? Like,
well, that I talk about that, and the thing that is being tried to be enshrined in law is the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Zionism, and in large measure, not completely conflating it with anti-Semitism, but trying to draw some distinctions. What happened is this definition became the driving excuse and force by the Trump administration and its crackdown, and they're, forcing everyone to sort of obey this and go along with this conflation. And so if you're saying it's basically created this massive Mack truck size opening for real anti-Semites, because if you're saying, oh, any criticism of Israel is essentially anti-Semitic, which is the takeaway from a lot of the mainstream Republican and Democratic messaging. But it's important to note the guy who actually co-wrote the definition said, "Halt it! You are weaponizing this to crush dissent." But of course, he was ignored. The guy who actually wrote the nuanced, scholarly definition, and so now this has created this huge opening where, by them smearing every critic of Israel and its policies as anti-Semitic, the real anti-Semites, oh boy, they're stepping up there. And that's why these propagandists, like particularly Tucker and Candace, who, just to remind you, is so popular. She now is among the world's leading podcasters in terms of per video views and downloads. And on some weeks, she eclipses Joe Rogan. So she's the most explicit anti-Semite our country has seen, with the biggest audience since Father Coughlin in the 1930s. She's unbelievable, and she's a great communicator and sounds so credible. And what she's done is she's created this anti-Israel perspective that even gets normies, as Wajid Ali mocks them, going, well, she's making some good sense here. And so Tucker is making these comments also, which are, you take a 30-second soundbite. Well, that makes sense. That's something that Peter Beinart might say about, the excessive influence of AIPAC on it. But they're basically taking the wide open given to them by the mainstream leaders of the Republican Democratic Party in their unquestioned, rah-rah hawkish support of Israel, and taking full advantage of it. So their carrot is, oh, look at all our anti-Israel criticisms that you nice people and you progressives agree with, and then they begin bringing in their own anti-Semitism as part of the package, and it's helping turn whole generations, certainly the younger generation, into more explicit anti-Semites. That's sort of my read. What is your take on their role in all this?
I mean, I think that is largely correct. I think the issue is a lot more pronounced on the right just because,
Oh, yes.
like in progressive media, there is like, a nice, well, nice is the wrong word, but an ecosystem of, media that will be critical of the Israeli government and its policies that does not exist on the right, like
Right.
in any sort of comparable form. So I think you're correct that we've seen people with very explicit, very frankly like genocidal, almost anti-Semitic beliefs coming in to fill that vacuum, and I think the vacuum is a lot larger on the right, but it also does exist, on the left to a lesser degree, and
Yeah,
that
I
that
agree,
should be acknowledged too.
but here's something that's happened though, because of her conspiracy thinking, can't on who killed Charlie Kirk and raising questions about whether even Erica Kirk and Mossad and the French Foreign Legion somehow were conspiring to kill Charlie Kirk. What's happened is, and I got to give you, so you have people like Max Blumenthal, who has a lot of credibility on the left and was an early supporter of boycotts, sort of acknowledging, and then you have Sam Sater and the Majority Report and the Young Turks, all kind of giving shout outs to Candace Owens as making a lot of sense about Israel. And to a certain degree, some of them are buying into her conspiracy thinking about Charlie Kirk, being killed by various nefarious forces. And one thing that really blew me away was Candace had a a long form interview with Norman Finkelstein, the heroic historian who's Jewish and so critical of, the horrific actions of the Israeli government and fairly respected and beloved by many on the left. And so he's granting her a great credibility with progressives and some centrists, even though,
Well,
of course, there's criticisms of Finkelstein too. But I'm just saying that was very shrewd
Fin-
on her part.
Finkelstein is frequently gets, well, this is the base Jew. This is the one Jew who's based. You see that like from the Groyper class. So I just want to say that about him. I mean, he certainly has some of his work I hold in very positive point of view, but he does entertain these people. I wanted to ask you something because you briefly mentioned just how the foreign policy, the correlation between the foreign policy actions and anti-Semitism. Foreign policy abroad. Obviously, there's another timeline here. We did this thing with Charlie. To mention Charlie Kirk as being the sort of the springboard for this current moment. There's a different path that kind of starts at October 7th itself,
Right.
because certainly that took a lot of underlying conversations about Israel and Israel's foreign policy into into the stratosphere online. Like people just like, then it went from underneath the surface of all dialogue to being on the surface. I don't know if you've seen this, but like the man who tried to carry out an attack in Michigan, apparently his family members died in Lebanon.
Lebanon, right. The one on yes, that attack in Michigan. Yes, the
I don't think
temple,
you can
the
have a
synagogue.
clearer correlation there than like a direct, you know what I mean. Of course, um, sick behavior on his part, but there's also this kind of like, well, well, my family was killed. Now I'm going to. It seems like that is playing out a lot. In smaller ways, just people seeing things abroad, seeing video footage, and then reacting. I wonder if you could comment on that and how do you even do that without victim blaming, victims of anti-Semitism, for example? Like how do you do it and say, hey, like maybe we should have a foreign policy that is better at protecting Jews at home, right? Just by how do you make that correlation? Because otherwise you point to somebody who was nearly killed in that synagogue or any of the people who lost people at Tree of Life and say, hey, this is actually Israel's fault. I don't think that messaging works. So it's, I guess, from either a progressive stance or even what would be better from a Republican.
Well, this is very common. Basically, essentially, a lot of what might be seen as legitimate criticism of Israel's role, when filtered by a person who's mentally unbalanced, that's where it can create what amounts to stochastic terrorism. If you keep hounding, now he may not be consuming Candace Owens that much. He may be consuming Muslim anti-Israel stuff, but he's mentally unbalanced, and then it triggers actions. The problem that we have right now is that the hawkishness on Israel has not, and just to use it has not led, has definitely made Jews less safe. Unfortunately, there's not a strong voice within mainstream Republican or Democratic circles to be critical of Israel in a meaningful way. In terms of
I liked Bernie
prominent
Sanders doing
leaders,
it here and there because he himself is Jewish, right? At least, ethnically Jewish. I don't know. I don't know if Bernie
who
practices or
did you
not.
just mention? I did.
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, of course. Yes, I didn't hear
Yeah,
that.
and
Yes.
so it's like, because I have Arab on my mother's side, I always was relieved to hear Bernie do it because it was like, okay, he's shouldering on, sometimes it's more helpful when it comes from a Jewish person, just because it doesn't, sometimes the target when Arab critics or brown critics of Israel speak up, there's a lot of presumption that the person is coming from an anti-Semitic place or this, that, or the other thing. Um, you know, I haven't heard anything like that on the Republican side at all. Like, sort of
Right.
evenly
There's
things go.
across the right-wing media ecosphere and political leadership, there isn't a single voice that's both critical of Israel and critical of anti-Semitism in the Republican Party. There's no Peter Beinart in the Republican Party. Someone, it's just because, Cruz and the people who are speaking out, Ben Shapiro, there's not a credible voice against anti-Semitism on the right, coming from the right, because they're so all in on hawkishness on Israel and defending Israel to the nth degree. Um, and and that's what's so problematic, is that there's not a credible messenger who could influence young people, um, you know, because Charlie Kirk, that's the whole point. Obviously, progressives know that there was this Saint Charlie Kirk, and they just covered up his outrageous bigotry and racism and xenophobia and polarizing actions. Even though he wasn't explicitly anti-Semitic, he basically was part of the general pro-authoritarian, bigoted worldview that helped, galvanize young people, to be for Trump and against liberal democracy and pluralism. And, you know, and it does seem, but there is some truth that he was trying to back away somewhat from being so pro-Israel in his final months of his life, because he could read what his base was telling him. On the other hand, you'd never see him overtly criticize anti-Semites at all. So right now, there's this total lack.
He hired Jack Posobiec,
Yes,
Yeah.
and Jack's.
so let's not forget that.
Well, I talk about Jackson. So there was this outrageous anti-Semite podcaster who was walking around backstage with the Cookie Monster
Myron
sweatshirt.
Gaines.
Yeah.
Myron Gaines, right. Myron
Yeah.
Gaines, what I don't understand is why he even had a first name that's sort of Jewish sounding, but let's forget that. Myron Gaines is walking around backstage with this Cookie Monster sweatshirt that shows, the Cookie Monster and cookies going into an oven, and it's echoing a Holocaust denial meme promoted initially by Nick Fuentes, like, hey, you can't even cook 6 million cookies at one time. How would they have ended up killing 6 million Jews in the ovens? Of course, Jews weren't killed just by the ovens. Nonetheless, Jack Posobiec, puts his arm around him, poses with him, and Posobiec is a major speaker. He speaks at the event, and it's hard for a younger generation to know he's the actual podcast voice of human events that
Yes.
once was the Russell Kirk rational conservatism. And now this guy is still a leading figure who is interviewed on CNN and other places about mourning for his good friend Charlie Kirk. And here he is putting his arm around the Cookie Monster guy.
I should
It's just
say
crazy.
Jack Posobiec also did something else, which is in April of 2017, promoted what is it? ONR is the name of the group. I can't remember their name. I have to look it up again. It's a Polish neo-fascist group.
Oh yeah,
that in the 1930s bombed Jewish homes, and there's a picture of some kind of blonde chippy dressed in her little fashy outfit, and he's like, Polish patriotism, and like shared this with his MAGA followers.
Well, he's best known being the lead promoter of Pizzagate, if I'm correct.
We're well versed on Jack on this show.
I don't have to tell you that.
Yeah, but I mention it because he's like a really good example of the lack of message discipline on Jews in general. His hiring, their association.
Tell me what you mean by lack of I think they are disciplined. They're anti-Semites.
They're disciplined. Okay, there you go. But like their inability to like keep a story together that is coherent, I guess it would be the case. They always bring Jack around, as we've just pointed out, why he might be somebody who you would not want to associate with. And Charlie Kirk yet hired him. Bannon hired him. Bannon is probably another good example of somebody like this. But Jack also had his honeymoon in Israel, and he also, when I wrote an investigation about him, brought out all of these like weird far right rabbi type figures who are like extremely anti-Muslim to like say that, hey, Jack's a good guy. Jack's my Jew. He's like, he's my honorary Jew. You don't call him an anti-Semite. It's crazy.
It's like Mark Levine getting up on the stage and being like, Trump is the most Jewish president we've ever had.
Stuff like this is very
shtick,
frequent. Yeah, very frequent. You see the stuff like this.
Well, that's the other thing is, and it's so important to realize that the people who are accepting anti-Semitism or actively promoting it are so overtly hostile to Muslims, to trans people, to blacks, every bigotry. So even the people who are calling out like Ted Cruz or Lindsey Graham, although obviously there's questions on Lindsey, all of those people who are, or Ben Shapiro, who's I really reference. So Ben Shapiro is a bigot on every single minority group except Jews. And then suddenly he realizes this movement that he's promoted through his very effective leadership of the Daily Wire. Oh boy, there's some anti-Semites in there and he doesn't like them. Hey, if you're helping amplify bigotry, well, you're naturally going to amplify anti-Semites because it goes along with other bigotry because they usually run in packs, bigoted views.
That kind of gets me to a point I wanted to make sure we talked about, which was, I mentioned earlier in the piece, you've included some bits and pieces from a conference where they were trying to address anti-Semitism in the GOP as some of the big leaders in the party and in the activist space around it are kind of scratching their heads, trying to figure out what they can actually do about it. And I want to get your take on it, but I think what you just said is so true, which is that when you build a movement promoting, all kinds of bigotries, all kinds of prejudices against, a whole wide range, a whole host of different identities, whether they be immigrant, racial minorities, religious minorities, whatever. It is absolutely absurd to think that anti-Semitism would not be part of that
Right.
mix, that you can somehow engineer, like, that you could somehow inflame all of these movements except this little corner over here. It is ridiculous. And I, you know, I think the efforts from the Ted Cruzes and Ben Shapiro's and whatever may have you of the movement to try to, tamp down on the anti-Semitic stuff. I think a big reason it doesn't feel like it's working or it doesn't feel like they're taking it seriously is because they are also unwilling to give up the rest of the bigotry menu,
Right.
right?
Right.
They're just like going back to the drawing board and being like, "Oh God, what? I thought we could do this. Let's just try to do it harder." What's your
I
read
think
on
an
that?
analogy, it's not always motivated by greed, but I consider anti-Semitism sort of as the longest hate. It's sort of money lying on the ground that they can pick up. It's just sitting around there, always available to be tapped in. And of course, I don't use this term in the piece, but Donald Trump is the anti-Semite in chief, and he's given this imprimatur to bigotry that's then gotten even more explicit by those underneath him. The problem right now with the bigotry that they've unleashed is they, of course, can't control it. But what I highlighted in the November conference that I attended um, was the original theocrats. I call them the old. They were trying to the old theocratic gang was going to come back for one more battle, so they literally had Ralph Reed and they had Tony Perkins. And, Tony Perkins' group, including by your former organization, Michael had referred to it as a hate group, and he even like this. There was even an anti-SPLC hearing last year where he was like criticizing SPLC for its actions and so on, and around calling him a hate group. But what I'm getting at is their solution was we will just double down on how Israel is the inheritor of the land that God gave them. And they even had video from Mike Huckabee too, who most recently said that Israel is entitled to the all of the Mideast.
Hey, that
But
was
they
like, say what you will about Tucker Carlson, he got that out of him.
right,
He asked
right,
him
and
like he asked him the same question like 3, 4 different ways before they pried it loose.
right, and
I just
go
want to. I
ahead.
don't mean to interject, but sorry, but you mentioned that Trump is the anti-Semite in chief. I think that's really interesting because, for one thing, I'm a New Yorker. Trump's a New Yorker. You can't do business like he did, in New York without knowing a lot of Jewish people, and he
Right,
certainly does. He's got Jews in his family also.
right.
Can you help explain that contradiction a little bit with Trump? Because he does seem very philo-Semitic at times, and culturally, as a New Yorker, I just feel like he understands Jewish people very well, like just
No,
based
but
on the.
I think it's a bigoted utilitarian view because he once said, "I don't want anybody counting my money except if they're wearing yarmulkes," or words to that effect. Okay,
Oh,
so so
It's so Trump too.
right,
Yeah.
so
it's anti-Semitic, but like said like he thinks it's a compliment.
Right.
right,
That's
and
what
then
makes Trump so difficult, right? I mean,
and then this is the
he's
point
challenging because
is
he speaks so plainly.
right,
Sometimes.
and you know, he's talked a lot about it's crazy that any Jew would vote for a Democrat, and if you did so, boy, I can't prevent what may happen to you, okay? And then, you can't get away from him inviting to his home for Thanksgiving, not a Photoshop at a conference, Nick Fuentes and Kanye West, okay? Kanye, whose latest video is Heil Hitler on you. I mean, notorious anti-Semites, and then him trying to explain it away. And this is the point that I think is very important. I focused on is the key thing that mainstream political leaders that Candace Owens won't do is they will always have some sop to mainstream media that gobble this up as true, where they deny that they're anti-Semitic. So he gave an interview that was, I think, in January or February, in which he said, "I'm not anti-Semitic, and I'm the least anti-Semitic person you could think of, and we don't need anti-Semites in MAGA." This is a front page review, front page article where at the same breath he declines to criticize anybody, Tucker or Fuentes or anybody. And then the JD Vance, after creating this open door, like, come on in, everybody, no purity test, he then gives an interview to a conservative leaning UK publication called Unheard, where he attacks Fuentes for calling him a race traitor because his wife is Indian American. And then Sotto Voce in that interview or another interview goes, "Of course I'm against anti-Semitism." And this then is these comments by people who are openly enabling anti-Semitism or personally championing anti-Semitic tropes is then pointed to by their right-wing allies as examples. Well, they can't be anti-Semitic because they said they aren't. I mean, that's how nutty it is. And they're self-evidently either accepting of anti-Semitism or openly promoting anti-Semitic tropes. And I think that would cover almost everybody in the Republican Party, with the exception of people like Cruz or Lindsey Graham or Ben Shapiro. But in general, the default view is, the bigger tent is necessary. And this is the point that I went into in my article that I think has some real value, which is looking, and the others have pointed this out, but which is how DHS and the Labor Department and others had this very explicit neo-Nazi coded messaging about, which way Western Man, which was, a Holocaust denial book, and, having Proud Boy anthems, "We'll reclaim our land again." So there was so much coding, and they even, I think one of the places even had a sound clip of Michael Jackson singing "Jew Me, Kike Me" or whatever in some kind of song that Michael Jackson did that he got some criticism over and saying I was trying to critique bigotry. But that government social media accounts are pushing out neo-Nazi and neo-Nazi adjacent propaganda. And the stuff and the shocking part of that is this propaganda came out within the days of the killing of Peretti and Renee Good. So it's like, hey, so the rest of most Americans are appalled by the killing in cold blood of by ICE and Border Patrol and the outrageous immediate lying, they're all domestic terrorists, but their sub-audience, they like this. They like this. And I quote this really smart guy from Vox who said, what's happening is that these social media teams are drawn from the far right types and people who are sympathetic to the Groypers. And he says the government we have now is by and for and about the Groypers. So the messaging, the social media teams are very Nick Fuentes friendly, which is, should be very alarming.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that they want to, what do they say, have the cake and eat it too, right? They want to try to bolster their public support, even, as you point out, lift their public messaging straight from these, cesspools of online hate. But they also want to, not pay the social price or, potential political price for doing that. And it's really disappointing that a lot of, seemingly a lot of mainstream publications and that sort of thing are willing to take them at their word when you've got a government, lifting, white power anthems in their videos and then the officials coming out and being like, "No, no, I'm not a bigot. You're the bigot." You know,
Yeah, or it's just a song. We used a
it's
song. What's the big
ridiculous.
deal?
I mean, but
But
we have to call a spade at some point. But
yeah, but what's happened here though that is really important to understand is, and I know this is maybe repeating a point, in earlier decades, even though anti-Semitism may have been part of the base, and Trump in 2016, for instance, don't forget that his ending message by him and third party people were ads where they talked about the Wall Street crisis, and that every single person in the voiceover was Jewish. And then, of course, they had the photo on a Jewish star of Hillary Clinton on a mountain of cash. So he is, but even then, they try to pretend as if they're not anti Semitic. And that has been the whole, playing footsie with neo Nazis. That has been the default practice. And what's changed in the last 2 years has been the open platforming of really horrific people in and out of their administration and the welcoming of them. And that is what is particularly dangerous. And there is this across the board rise in anti-Semitism across demographic groups and even some political ideologies that is being tapped into, in particular on the right. And that's what's so alarming. I mean, your former organization was always talking, each of their, which you probably edited, their annuals would come out. They'd be talking about the mainstreaming of hate. That would be the takeaway. Well, the mainstreaming of hate has now gone so off the charts
I mean,
that
that
it's
that that fight has been fought and lost, in my opinion, and
right.
there are a lot of reasons why that would be the case. I think we're frequently, Jared and I are trying to pick up the pieces here on the show, and to understand, I guess, what had happened. But yeah, I will say, as for SPLC, there are a lot of things you can say negative about SPLC, and I can be the person to do it. But their hate group designations are generally pretty strong, you know, and they were generally pretty right, and almost all of those people have, you know, they've just been redeemed, like, culturally, partly through Elon Musk, partly through Trump.
Right.
These are very rich people who came in and did that.
yeah, Art, with the time we have left, because we're coming up on the clock here, I just want to get your personal take on this. The MAGA movement, despite the efforts of a honestly small number of pundits, politicians that are sort of, ostensibly speaking out against anti-Semitism on the right, but as we've discussed, not really putting in the legwork to make it meaningful. If in our last episode, Mike and I, on the main feed, Mike and I talked about how this is really becoming a crisis for the MAGA movement, and it's our view that this could be part of what ultimately kills it, right? Like MAGA will almost certainly not last forever, and this may be a big element in its downfall. But what do you see as, I do you think the MAGA movement is in any kind of place to actually reconcile this issue? And if they don't, what do you see as the danger there?
Well, my view is that I don't see them as long as Donald Trump and the leaders the MAGA movement is essentially a personality cult. And as long as Donald Trump is super hawkish on Israel, lies through his teeth, and is allowing people in his administration and allies to be openly anti Semitic or embracing, they're not going to reconcile, they're not going to try to drive it out of their own movement. And I think that the MAGA movement is going to shrink. However, the big risk that I foresee is even though they may become more explicitly anti-Semitic, which in normal political times would mean, well, that means they're going to be horrifying to a majority of Americans and they'll lose in the midterms. But there's so much effort to kind of suppress the vote and interfere with the vote coming from the Trump administration that public outrage against explicit anti-Semitism as part of the hate-filled messaging from the MAGA movement may not be sufficient if our elections aren't free and fair. And that's the risk that we face now.
That's a very big issue. I should also add that, should we be able to protect our democracy, our flawed democracy, which is not a given, if the Republican Party should become populist and anti-Semitic, right, using Jews as a scapegoat, the way they use immigrants as a scapegoat in recent elections,
and trans people.
Well, trans people for sure. But I mean, if Jews become the scapegoat, it's that type of populist movement. We're all in a lot of trouble. So, if they were able to win with it, let's put it that way, that would be some serious. I mean, one thing we can't only be doom and gloom. I will say, I'd be curious of your thoughts on this. I also think this very issue that you're describing today has the capacity to destroy the Republican Party forever.
I think it's toxic enough. The problem is that the people who most likely to be critical of overt anti-Semitism, let's say coming from the center and the center left, the mainstream people who have the microphones on the Democratic Party are generally super hawkish on Israel. And so the problem is, it's similar to the issue on the right. The Republicans speaking out against anti-Semitism are hawkish on Israel. And the people, who speak out maybe against anti-Semitism, maybe like Chuck Schumer or whatever, are relatively hawkish on Israel. And so there's not a full-scale grappling across ideologies about how the pariah nature of Israel and the hostility that it's generating and increasingly generating with this Iran war after the atrocities in Gaza is not being grappled with by the mainstream institutional outlets in our country. And if there were, then it's possible that some leaders and some mainstream media outlets could educate and horrify people about anti-Semitism, but they'd have more credibility if they were critical of Israel also. And I don't see that happening.
Public opinion polling is pretty clear on how most people feel about what's happened in Israel. I guess we could only hope that some folks over on Capitol Hill wake up and see which way the wind's blowing and get into that vacuum.
Right.
To actually fight the fight. Well, Art, thanks for joining Posting Through It this week. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll put a link to the story you wrote for Washington Spectator and your book down in the description.
Thank you so much.
But it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Really, really nice to meet you.